Good afternoon and welcome to this Institute for Government event to discuss how can public spending do better at improving well-being. I'm Gemma Tetlow, I'm the IFG's Chief Economist, and I'm delighted to be chairing today's event. And this event today is inspired by the work in a new paper published by Professor Lord Richard Layard, which makes the case that a rational government should assess all of its policies against their impact on the population's well-being and reducing misery, and allocate funding to whatever policies will do the greatest job for limited cost at improving people's well-being. Professor Layard is probably well known to many, if not all, of the people viewing today. He's the founder director of the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics and co-director of their Community Wellbeing programme. And his new paper builds on many years of work in this field, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and so we're delighted he's here to share his latest thinking on this. In the context of a new government who will very soon be making decisions about how to allocate hundreds of billions of pounds a year of public spending, I'm delighted that we can have this conversation about how should we think about how those spending priorities are chosen. We're going to start with a short presentation from Professor Layard, and then we will have some response remarks from our other panellists. On my left, we have Conrad Smewing, who's the Director General for Public Spending at the Treasury. On my right, we have Lord Gus O'Donnell, who was previously Cabinet Secretary, but also now serves as Chair of Trustees of Pro Bono Economics, which is an organisation which uses economic analysis to help charities and others to tackle the causes and consequences of low personal well-being in the UK. So I think some of Gus's cards are probably on the table about the importance he thinks that well-being should have in how we prioritise. And finally, we have Amanda Rowlett, who until very recently was Chief Economist at the Department for Transport and before that at other government departments, but now also serves as the Vice Chair of the Central and North West London Mental and Community Health Trust. So a variety of perspectives that she will be able to bring. So thank you very much for that. We'll have plenty of time for questions from all of you. If you're watching online, please do start sending them in via Slido. If you're happy to tell us who you are and where you're tuning in from, that would be great. It's always interesting to know where people are coming from. And for those of you in the room, we will come to you as well when we get to that point. But first, Richard, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Gemma, and thank you all for coming, including all those people online. But thanks especially to the members of this wonderful team. This is a team product. We've got here Christian and David, and somewhere online we've got Sarah in Scotland and Isaac in, we believe, Uzbekistan. That's who we are. So I think this is a very promising moment in the history of our country because we've got the prospect of a stable government for 5 years. We've got a spending review that's been given proper time to prepare itself over 5 months or so. And this is really an opportunity to introduce a little more rationality into the process of government. So when it comes to spending, what would be rationality in spending? Well, I think the first key thing is that there has to be a single objective, because if you're trying to compare the importance of one type of spending and another, you can't do it except by comparing their effects on some common outcome. And the outcome that we should be worried about is the well-being of the people. This is, of course, a long-standing objective, and it's actually stated in the Treasury Green Book that well-being is the objective. So this is not revolutionary. What is revolutionary, perhaps, is to take it more seriously and really try and dig out the evidence about it. So what should the spending review be trying to do? It should be trying to maximise the well-being of the people, subject to the amount of money that's available. And the way to solve that problem is to look at every proposal, look at the well-being benefits it produces per pound of expenditure, take the highest until you've exhausted all the money you've got. That's a standard approach, of course, in benefit cost analysis, but we should be very serious about it, and we should be serious about putting that at the centre of the spending review and the case for different types of expenditure. Now, fortunately, we have a Prime Minister who has this view, and you can read it yourselves. the Treasury should weigh not just its effect on national income, but its effect on well-being. So this has got to be the goal. And this statement by Keir in the initial first party conference speech that he gave has been the trigger for our project. Because it seemed to us that it's all very well to say this, and we've been saying it for a while, but you've got to give worked examples to show people that it can be done in a comprehensive kind of way. And that's what we set out to do in this project. Now, the background to this is that Chris here and Paul Freitas wrote a manual for how this should be done, but without worked examples. Then the Treasury Green Book was revised in 2020 to encourage the use of direct evidence on well-being, where that was the only kind of evidence that could be provided and could be combined with willingness to pay to get a benefit-cost ratio. But this has not actually been done to a large extent since then. So now is the time really to apply the Green Book, and essentially that's what we're doing in this project and this report. So that's the method. Just to be clear, the method is the top of the benefit-cost ratio is the gains in life satisfaction converted into money using the Green Book coefficient. And the denominator is the cost, which is, of course, the original cost minus the flow back. And we're very interested in policies, of course, that produce high flowbacks, such as ones that produce higher employment and income, but also other sources of public sector savings. So let me just give you a few results. So obviously the top policies are the ones where the flowback is so high that there is no net cost. Those are no-brainers. The particular ones that we've looked at have been mainly mental health. So NHS talking therapies, which now sees 750,000 people, of whom a half recover, that has demonstrably got no net cost. Unfortunately, that doesn't cover people suffering from addiction or more serious conditions. We are very keen to see in the spending review a new parallel service set up for people suffering from addiction. Isaac did a very good cost-benefit analysis. Again, it pays for itself in 2 years, as does extended mental health psychological therapy for young people. But of course, most public expenditure does cost money. And then we go to this benefit-cost ratio as a criterion. And the striking thing, of course, is the incredible variation. And I think that this ought to be at the centerpiece of the spending review, just the huge differences that there are between different types of activity. I can't go through them all. I must say that we went into this with a pretty open mind on most of the policies, but not on apprenticeship, which has turned out to be very cost-effective because of its effects on employment as well as income. But we have been urging for some time that just as a young person qualified for university can expect to find a place, so a person qualified for apprenticeship should be able to expect to find a place. That was enshrined in law in 2009, and unfortunately the next government repealed the act, but we need to reinstate that. The other, sorry, I'm doing this badly. The other point I want to make is that obviously we need to find places where we can save money, so we need to look at where the low ones are coming in. Roads are not that high, it has to be said. But I'd just make a comment on the state pension age, because this is such a major strategic thing in the ageing society. From the last time the pension age was raised to 66, just before the pandemic, we can tell by comparing the well-being of the different cohorts affected and not affected by it, that the well-being losses were quite small from the loss of the state pension age at 66, relative to the huge savings in cost, something like 6 billion for 1 year's state pension. So this is an issue which needs to be thought of for strategic development over this Parliament. It is going to be raised once, but it should be raised as soon as possible thereafter again. So these are just examples what we've taken, as you can see. But there are obviously an incredible number of policies that are going to have to be looked at in the spending review. Fortunately, there's time to do it properly, and we really hope that departments would be asked in their bids to include a benefit-cost ratio and to argue their case around the benefits relative to the costs. I think that's the ethical basis for government. That government is about improving people's well-being. It's also prudential for the government, because the research we've done shows that that's the way to get re-elected. This is therefore the punchline. Make BCRs central to the spending review and get re-elected. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Gus, I'll come to you.
Thank you. So I want to go out to the slightly bigger picture and think about, this report gives you some practical examples, but what's behind it? And what is it that basically the government should be trying to do and explaining what it's doing? So if we start from where we are today, new government, big majority, says it's inherited a terrible situation and that things will get worse before they get better. Hence the slogan is, fix the foundations. Now, curiously enough, nobody gets excited about foundations. Let's be perfectly honest. What's important is what you build on those hopefully stronger foundations. And what are we going to try and build? We're going to try and build, as Richard said, better lives, right? How are you going to measure better lives? And this is the interesting thing, where we come to the reality versus perception, right? So I was very taken by Jonathan Ashworth, who's just come back from Democratic National Convention in the States, and looking at the situation there, where on the objective criteria of GDP growth and all the rest of it, America's doing really well. And yet, Trump is doing extremely well. And when you look at it, Trump is doing extremely well in areas where there is very low life satisfaction, right? And the perception there is, of course, that you can have these things, but if they're not feeding through to people's lives and their perception of their lives, you're going to go wrong. So we really need to move away from saying, oh, well, we got GDP up, is to actually, do people believe that their lives are more satisfying or more worthwhile, which is the essence of what the well-being approach is doing. So that's the first thing I'd say. We know that this point about reality and perception is important. If you go back to New Labour, we were talking about this earlier, when you look at the crime thing, it wasn't we're going to reduce crime and the fear of crime, because perception was really, really important. And that, if you take that through more generally, is an important part of where we are. Also on the economic side, you just need to read Paul Johnson's article, I think it was in yesterday's Times, about pensioners' incomes, young adults and jobs, income and wage inequality, to know that there are big perceptions out there about what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years that are completely wrong. Because he puts these facts at the start and then explains why none of them are actually true. Right? So, well worth going back to. So basically, if you have a government that's decided it's going to do things through missions and deliver missions, then the question becomes, how are you going to decide on whether the missions have worked? And basically, I would be saying, and this is where it comes back to the whole spending review, have they improved people's lives as perceived by themselves? Not by someone else, but by themselves. And I think that's important. So if we look at the growth agenda, you could improve that by getting the right kind of growth, creating incomes and jobs that we know will have dramatic impacts on life satisfaction. Or we could get GDP growth, as I've said many times before, by opening all the coal mines and stopping people volunteering, getting them on the streets, selling drugs. So basically, we know that there are really important things, but what's the success measure? If the success measure is just GDP, you're going to go wildly wrong, right? You might hit the target and miss the point, to use something that we've done for a number of times. You can do these things. In here, there's a lot of work on particular projects. I know the new government is also interested in this. I know DCMS have asked Frontier Economics, which I happen to chair, to looking at the well-being impact of work on culture and heritage. And there we're doing work that looks at productivity, that looks at well-being, that looks at fiscal impacts and all the rest of it. Things that I know from a Treasury point of view you'd be interested in as well. So there are lots of things we can do here, but you do need that overarching objective because there will be trade-offs. And if you haven't got the overarching objective about trying to improve people's lives, and as Richard said, the great benefit for this is actually if you do increase well-being, you tend to get re-elected, and it's rather better than those standard economies. Things. So for me, and if you need any more about the US, you know, those statistics, like if you're poor in the US, your life expectancy is 5 years less than the poorest in Blackpool, something that Bern Murdoch pointed out in the FT. I mean, there's some dramatic things going on if you just look at averages. You really need to think about, which is why this says improve well-being and reduce misery. We need to be thinking about those things which have an impact on reducing inequalities in well-being. And the way you raise average well-being easiest is by working with those with very low well-being. And that's really important. It's not quite the same as poverty, but poverty reduction is a big part of it. We need to make sure that it also gives you a line into place-based thinking. Where are those places where there's no hope? If you look at the work that Carol Graham's done in the States, for example, there's a really interesting line into how you turn the levelling up agenda, which I assume will have to have different words because it's a different party, into something better. Then there's a real route in by looking at those areas where there's no hope, there's the well-being, their view about their lives is terrible, and you can turn that round. Those would all be the benefits that would come into the sorts of projects which, if we adopted this approach more generally in the next spending review, are worthwhile. Finally, to give my advice to the Treasury when they're sitting here is a bit crazy. But if I were Perm Sec of the Treasury again, I would be thinking very carefully about getting some political direction, because I know it's a very political process. It's not project by project. That whole point about what's the size of the cake is a political decision, and then how do you allocate that cake? I'd say thinking about both of those things in terms of what are your aspirations for improving overall life satisfaction, improving well-being, and where do you know from the research we've got are the areas which give you the biggest bang per buck. And that's the big picture, and then into that comes the individual parts of, so these projects really work for this, and these ones are a real waste of time. And it's good that this report includes some of the things where that it really doesn't work. For example, taking money from poor people and giving it to rich people is a really dumb idea, right? And government does that in all sorts of ways. So please, if one other thing they could do, that would be a smarter place to start. That's it.
Thanks very much, Gus. So, Conrad.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Richard, and the team for producing this report, which is incredibly useful for us and also very timely. As you said, there is a big spending review coming up, and having this at the start of our preparations is just like really crucially useful for us and for all spending teams in the Treasury. And I know, I mean, you quoted the Prime Minister, but I know my immediate boss, the Chief Secretary, is also really interested in this way of thinking about public spending. So I think it's great that we're having this event. I just wanted to say a few things. The first one, I mean, I think the kind of central point that you're making here, that we need to look much wider than GDP and incomes in assessing what we do in public policy and public spending, is really very widely accepted these days. You only have to kind of think about what would happen to GDP if I came around and broke all of your windows, to recognise that that's not a great measure, or not the only measure that you want to be using for thinking about public policy. So, this way of thinking, I think is crucial for public policy, and that's one of the reasons the government has already gone quite a long way down this route under the influence of many people who are on this panel. So, we have the ONS survey on wellbeing, which I think we've got 13 years of data on now, and Richard already mentioned the revisions to the Green Book in 2020, I think, to bring wellbeing analysis into that sort of core options appraisal document. And we also have the kind of wellbeing analysis board within government, which I think Amanda used to chair. You might want to say a bit more about that. But it's not just the sort of guidance and the framework. It's been a clear impact on policy as well. Again, much of it down to Rich and colleagues' work, particularly if you think of the history of what the government has done on mental health. That has moved from something where it was not really getting the same level of attention as physical health was, but now we are in a position where the rollout of talking therapies, the extra money that the government announced, I think, at the autumn statement last year, not only was that a big investment, but when the OBR was producing their economic and fiscal forecasts, they were looking at the wider impacts of that investment in mental health on the labour market, and therefore on welfare spending and on tax revenue. So that is those are all really great strides. But I think there is definitely more that we can do. It's not enough just to have good guidance. We need to have broad awareness of that guidance, and as this report is providing, really usable, worked examples of how you would apply it. And so it's really great that we've got this report in time, and I will be sending it around all the spending teams in the Treasury, and they'll be sharing it with the relevant departments, who I'm sure, well, the ones with the high BCRs will be very excited. Anyway, but I thought I would just take a minute or two to kind of recognise some of the limitations of this, which I think the team here would also sort of recognise. So first of all, I think this is a good way of thinking about microeconomic decisions. But for the macroeconomic decisions, GDP may not be your end goal, but it is a really important means to your goal. And BCR thinking doesn't necessarily work particularly well when you're thinking about the overall level of tax, the overall level of spending, stability of the macroeconomy. Those sorts of things are less tractable in this framework. The second thing is that it's more challenging to apply for areas of public spending which are fundamentally about risk or about resilience. So I think kind of Gus said, no one gets excited about foundations until they collapse. So the sort of maximization heuristic of let's put all the money into the highest BCR thing on our analysis works well until you realize you have missed something in your analysis. Defense spending would be a classic example of this. You probably could do a Wellbeing analysis of the nuclear deterrent, but I don't think it would add very much to the issues that you're thinking about. And then the last thing, and I know you recognise this, but I think it is crucial to say it again. What really matters is what works here. So there's thinking about Wellbeings rather than income as a way of doing your benefit cost ratio analysis. But what really matters is, does this policy actually have the impact that we hope that it is going to have? Does it have an impact at small scale, and will it scale? And one of the great things about the sort of history of talking therapies is there's really good evidence, randomized controlled trials and otherwise, that is working. You need that as well as this kind of framework for thinking about where to allocate public spending.
Great, thank you very much. Final.
Thank you. I suppose I'm speaking last as the sort of economist on the panel, and I have been involved with the Wellbeing Analysis Board for many years, formerly Social Impacts Task Force. In my experience, economists do all recognise that social impact is what government should be doing and is what cost-benefit analysis should be. We call it utility. It's a very similar concept, essentially the same as wellbeing. So I don't think there's any lack in the community of an appreciation that this matters. However, it has proved there isn't a culture of automatically trying to include well-being wherever possible. And there are some good reasons for this. I mean, firstly, historically, we've had very little data on it, and economists, government analysts do like some robustness in what they do. That has got better, but there's still further to go. Secondly, there's the risk of double counting. So QALYs, which are measures of healthiness that the Department of Health use, are used by lots of departments, but they don't fully cover well-being. So then there's the worry, if you put well-being in alongside, will you be double counting? So there's that risk. To me, though, the most fundamental one, and I think one why the Treasury has sometimes been a bit concerned, is you can come up with some really large numbers if you just ask people about well-being out of context, and then the Treasury get these things which are huge. One example, which I put very tentatively, is I worked for the Department for Transport, and we looked at the impact on the country of putting the road near Stonehenge underground. No impact on Stonehenge. If you visit, it's a bit quieter. The survey done with, I think, the best company in the country, lots of checks and balances, came up with a figure for £1 billion is the benefits gained by putting this road underground. And you couldn't have had a better team doing it. So you have to be really careful. So, and then thirdly, there's the point about you identify a well-being issue, you have to look really carefully about how to address that. Because with something like crime, people may be scared of crime because they don't know that crime is actually very low. When we had the recent murder on Cabham Common, I looked at the figures. It was much safer than I realised, and personally, I did start walking in the park at night. So, you know, it's a complicated area. So we do need a change. Wellbeing is represented perfectly respectably in the Green Book, and our guidance, our wellbeing guidance that sits under the Green Book, I personally think is very good, but then I would. But it hasn't imbued into the culture as a need to do in the way it should. And I think now is a brilliant time to have that strategic push, to have that top-down encouragement from the Treasury, but also combine that with a real in-depth looking at how you do this properly and a challenge when it's not done properly. And that's the other side of the coin. This is a great first start. As you recognise fully in your report, more needs to be done on top of this. People with more resources go into it in more detail. But if we're going to do the right things for the country, we do have to do this.
Very good.
Richard, I want to start with you, and perhaps one question to help people understand exactly what's going on in your modelling and what the implications of this would be. How do we think about the well-being of different people? Do you value improving my well-being the same as Gus's, Conrad's, Amanda's? How do you do that in your calculations, and is it uncontroversial how we think about that question?
Well, obviously, there is an issue to do with distribution. So if you go back to Bentham, which is where this comes from, Bentham said that the objective should be simply the sum of the well-being of everybody. I think today we're more sensitive to inequality, and we would like to give more attention to improvements in well-being for people who started off low than people who started high. How to do that in this context is not straightforward. The most obvious way to do would be to identify for the policymaker the benefits according to how many were accruing to people with different starting points, and let them just judge what if they want to give extra weight to people at the bottom. That's one thing. If you're looking at any old policy, you can do that. Just break the benefits and the benefit cost ratio down according to who the beneficiaries are. But of course, another issue is how to make sure you're doing enough for the people at the bottom. And that is a question of where you're looking for new policies, where you're looking for initiatives. So I was going to wave up my textbook, but I haven't got it here. But we've got a textbook which sets out what is known about the distribution of effects on well-being across different factors in people's lives. So if you want to know what are the main causes of low well-being in Britain? Number one is mental ill health. Number two, probably physical ill health. 3, bad relationships at home and at work. And 5, poverty. So this gives you some idea of where you should be looking to make breakthroughs to lift people from the bottom.
Conrad, I mean, you've already touched on this really, but could you just say a bit more how far you think the process within government at the moment is from the sort of approach that Richard lays out? And do you think we would come up with very different answers?
So I think we are like a way down this road, but I think we can do it better, as Amanda was saying. So I suppose the first thing I'd say is I think the natural way that comes to the kind of economists doing this stuff to focus mostly on monetary values and willingness to pay. It will get slightly different answers to this, and you may miss some really important areas where you ought to be shining a light, and mental health is like a good example of that you get quite big disparities between different ways of thinking about it. But that's kind of like, known, and people are onto that. I think to do this like really well, I think it would take a lot more of the kind of evidence and analysis that is in this report, and that is kind of has been tested a lot more. And I think the point that I made about like the actual impact and scaling of individual policies, I think that is a really important one, which is not just about this way of thinking about it, but about all public policy. That it's surprisingly hard to find good causal evidence on lots of things that we do. And that gap, I think, is one that we should place just as much weight on as this.
And do you have the concern that Amanda flagged of it being possible to come up with some very silly numbers, and that difficulty of where does that take you?
Yeah, I mean, that's very much linked to my point about robustness of evidence, that so if you kind of approach this from a sort of a priori point of view and kind of, start doing some back of the envelope stuff, you can get some very, very high numbers. And you might find that where on a sort of non-Welby set of comparisons, you'd be comparing BCRs of 2 to 1 and 3 to 1 and making that choice, you're like 18 to 1 versus 19 to 1. Have you got much further by doing that? So I do think that the kind of real nuts and bolts of the work that underlies all of this is really important.
And Gus and Amanda, do you have thoughts on Conrad's point about the suitability of this for micro versus macro decisions? And if we look down that list and think about allocating the marginal few pounds of money, where should it go most effectively? Is that the same? Do we need different ways of thinking about this? If we're thinking, if we really did allocate money in all of those areas and had vast mental health services but very poor quality roads, is it right to extrapolate this, or are there any sort of challenges in going from that sort of micro to macro?
Sure. I think, let me go back to imagining the future cabinet committee where they actually talk about the spending review and they think about the size of the cake and how to allocate it out. So what are the principles that should be guiding them then? So this is where you get the macro stuff, right? And one of the principles, I think, picking up what you said about security and defence, is we are going to have to spend more money on defence. Absolutely no question. Security is fundamental to people's well-being. So you go there and you say, okay, X percent. You're not going to do it at the margin. You're going to just say 3% of GDP or some number, whatever. Then you're going to come to the rest of it and say, well, where are the areas where we think that spending more, and this is where it goes to Richard's list, what are the big things that are going to make a difference here? Like education, prevention, there's a whole bunch of things. And so that can give you some guidance as to the kinds of things. It's not going to give you micro guidance, but it's going to give you a broad outlook as to what you really want to do. It's at the margin, not going to tell you about the size of the cake, which is a kind of much more complicated thing. But there are lots of things on the tax area where you could, directly go to like looking at the micro and saying, actually, these tax reliefs are really, really stupid, right? They cost us a fortune. They do almost nothing to change people's behaviour. And that amount of money, when, you've got people coming in with bids about, look, if I had an extra $1 billion, here's the kinds of things I could do. So I do think there's a macro discussion which gives you some broad priorities which go into the spending review for the Chief Secretary to go away in his negotiations with departments. And then once the departments have got their money, obviously the Treasury then just kind of basically lets them get on with it. Then within the departments, for them to start doing the micro work about saying, okay, so what is going to make the biggest difference to these big priorities that we've got? Which programs, what evaluation, what research have we got that tells us? And it's absolutely right. You can get some small things that don't replicate and you have to be really careful, but there are some broad areas we know. Like, for example, if you took mental health and you looked at it, suddenly IAPT comes along with a proper evaluation thing and you think, wow, you know, finally we've got something with real evidence and something which can scale up. And you just think about doing that elsewhere and you'll have lots of things where it'll turn out those programs that you funded actually don't make much difference. And it's just as important to start stopping the things that aren't working as it is to start, you know, putting more money behind the ones where we've got good evidence base where it does work.
Amanda?
Thanks. Picking up another aspect on risk. It seems to me that cost-benefit analysis is incredibly valuable when you're looking at risk, because you need to look at different scenarios, do the cost-benefit analysis in each of those scenarios and then put them together. It's not necessarily done as systematically as it could be, but actually I think that's just the tool you need for risk. And then when you're doing your cost-benefit analysis in a risky environment, it depends on the sort of risk. I mean, I'm not talking about defence necessarily here, but then you put your well-being into your cost-benefit analysis for the different scenarios and then look at those to understand the overall risk. Linked to that, if we take something like roads, or during COVID, we were looking at the underground system and whether we needed to continue to give money. And there were things like that where the transport system, if it had so little money that it broke down, it would be disastrous for the fabric of the country. So we also need not just to think about the marginal benefits, but also the existence value and how you maintain that existence in a cost-effective way. And then the last point, which came up, was macroeconomic policy, and GDP is a timely indicator of economic activity, and I would agree. Gus may have some cunning thoughts on this, but my inclination would be that that is what you look at when you're fine-tuning your macroeconomic policy, but you absolutely know that it's not the underlying objective for the country.
Great. I'd like to take some questions from all of you now. So if you're in the room, put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
Great. We'll take the two in the front row here first.
Hi there, I'm Jo Swinson, and I'm a strong supporter of this whole agenda, but I'm keen to just probe a little bit some of these limitations which Conrad outlined on things like resilience. And I just wondered about how this approach accounts for the well-being of future generations. So how are we thinking about discounting in these calculations? Are we sort of repeating the existing current economic assumptions about the value that we put on the experience of future generations, or is this an opportunity to just think differently about that? And I'm just intrigued when you're looking at things like road and rail, if, say, in Wales, where they've got a Future Generations Commissioner, they have concluded that those road projects that kind of looked so good under the current economic calculations, actually, when you start looking at it from the perspective of our children or our grandchildren, aren't such a good deal after all. So, yeah, put differently, what about the projects that we wish had been started 30 or 40 years ago, and how can we judge those?
I'll take a group of questions together and then we can come back to it. Next one. Yes.
Hi, Sushil Wadhwani. So I want to say at the outset that I've been following Richard's work for over 40 years. It's always wonderful. So I think we should say that up front. Great report. Now, in terms of questions, the first one actually is for you, Richard. So the Treasury, one of the things, if I understood the Treasury response, it was that in addition to well-being, they worry about stability and the fiscal rules and so on. And therefore, one of the things they look at in evaluating measures are the impact on the fiscal rules. So if one assumes that we care about the fiscal rules because we care about averting a gilts market crisis, which then has an impact on well-being, I wondered whether, to some extent, you could build in a small probability of a gilts market crisis in your well-being measures, and therefore allow for this in your ranking, because different things you do will have a different impact in terms of the fiscal rules. So it's a question. I then have a question for Gus. You very correctly talked about how the Democrats have been worrying about perception, in particular in terms of inflation. Inflation's come down nicely, but because most people confuse price levels with price changes, and price levels are much higher, certainly well-being isn't that great because people still feel poorer. Yeah. I guess my question is a philosophical one, is should we, as a government, be worrying about misperceptions and directly taking them into account in our measures of well-being, or should we be trying to correct the misperceptions? And then, sorry, Gemma, if you'll indulge me, one last question. This is a question for the Treasury. If I think back to the March 23 budget, the employment support measures to help people with moderate mental illness struck me as eminently sensible, and I was very encouraged to hear Richard say that the flow back would be greater than the cost. And I remember at the time thinking, that is what the OBR would conclude. But the OBR actually attached a big fiscal cost to those measures. And I was interested to hear you say the OBR has taken some of Richard's thinking into account, but I sort of wonder whether the OBR need to work harder. Sorry.
Great. So I think as we've got 4 questions there, I will come back to answers. Richard, Gus, Conrad, I'll get you to respond to Sushil's questions, and then do feel free to pick up Joe's as well while you're going.
Okay, on Joe's question, the view we took in this report is that we've already taken a decision about climate change, net zero and the path to net zero. So the issue then is not what we're going to try and do for future generations, but how we can do it at least cost. So that's how that should be thought of, but that's a fairly technical issue. What is the least cost way of achieving that trajectory for emissions? And we didn't feel we could take that on. Though obviously also in any other work that one looks at, if there is an impact on emissions, you should put a valuation on it, and we put the Treasury Green Book valuation on it. On Sushil's question about fiscal rules, I think it is possible to sort of, we have to be able to separate some issues off from others. We can't have everything completely interdependent. So I think the issue of sustainability of the debt and the path of the deficit is an issue that you've got to decide how much risk you're going to take on, and that gives you your rule. You don't have to trade that off against other things. I think that's not a possible way of proceeding. A bigger issue, of course, macro, is the size of the state. We took the view, I think Gus guided us in this direction. Don't get into what should be the size of the state. That's so political that take the size of the state and the size of the budget as given. But if you were to get into that debate, of course you would be interested in the fact that there are so many quite high benefit cost ratios around the place. But we didn't get into that.
Right. Gus, then second question about should we tackle misperceptions?
Can I just do the future generations bit first as well? Because remember, there's very few people who've ever worked in the Treasury who haven't spent their time reviewing the discount rate we should use for cost-benefit studies, right? I have done my bit many times. And the point about having a discount rate was frequently that you expect future generations to be richer, therefore you're discounting, right? If, instead of doing it in terms of income, we did it in terms of well-being, do we expect future generations' well-being to be higher? If you take the climate change view, you might well be expecting future generations' well-being to be lower, in which case you'd value future generations higher than current generations. You've got the problem there that the future generations, can't believe it, don't vote. Isn't that crazy? So you do have a political issue there. But for me, we should have a proper grown-up debate about future generations. So I think it's a really good point. On Susha's point about, obviously the best thing is what Amanda did was look up the real data, so you correct misperceptions about risk, right? Definitely first best. In the meantime, what do you do in a world where people have incorrect perceptions of the reality? And then I think you explicitly have to take those into account when formulating political policies to understand the impact they will have on people's lives and their perceptions, whilst at the same time doing all you can to correct the perceptions and get them in the right place. I think that's the answer there. On your fiscal rules thing, I did play around very early on doing the cost benefit with bringing this in, but not by an adjustment to the fiscal rules, but by shadow pricing public expenditure in these things. Because this is one of the things that if you're really on the ground in a spending team and someone says to you, you're going to spend this much and it's going to have this £1 billion worth of benefit later on somewhere else, and you're like, yeah, but hang on, I'm spending this now, this really counts for my deficit, I'm really worried about my deficit because you might have a sensible golden rule, then fine. Precisely how you would fit in doing this within a world where you've got a fiscal rule about years 4 to 5, the debt GDP ratio falling. Frankly, if any economist can give me an answer as to why that makes any sense at all as a rule, I will be really happy to hear it, but I've never heard one. So I think the fiscal rules, I'd start by looking at the fiscal rules, to be perfectly honest. But you're right, in some way we do need to build that in, absolutely.
And Conrad, the OBR's scoring of the mental health.
Yeah,
score.
and I might pick up the other two as well, because they're super interesting question, and I think that they are in some ways kind of linked, both the fiscal rules point and the sort of well-being and future generations climate change point, because I think they get to non-linearities in effect that, and this is kind of what I was trying to say when I was saying this works well for micro but not for macro. Yeah. That. If you're kind of considering policies where you get to a domain where you might have non-linear effects, like you might have a financial crisis, or you might have non-linear climate change effects, then the sort of like take a little bit off here and put a bit here, take a little bit off here, but it doesn't work quite so well. This is good for making decisions about what's optimal within a normal range. And I think both the kind of macro fiscal thing and the climate change thing speak to that. On the kind of OBR scoring point, I think this is one of those circumstances in which reasonable men can differ, or reasonable people can differ rather. I think that, don't quote me on this, but I think that they took a slightly more cautious view on what the impact of the policy would be in terms of labour market impact, and therefore, although they got to like significant offsets to the direct fiscal cost of the policy, they didn't get to it would be free or pay for itself. I'm not qualified to sort of to judge which is close to the truth. I can imagine that the OBR has doesn't do this sort of thing a lot, so it might have been a little bit more cautious than otherwise. But also B. Again, coming back to the micro-macro thing, when you're looking at the impact on a relatively small population, and you say this proportion of people going to work, that looks great, and then you can sort of say, well, this is the size of the impact. But if you're looking at the whole labour market, you've got an extra check to say, do I really think that the employment rate is going to jump from 70% to 75% as a result of this policy? Probably not. So it's that kind of extra robustness check.
I mean, Richard, on that, just to clarify what your numbers say exactly. So when you say that there's no net cost, that's to the Exchequer, and over what period of time do you expect that to be true?
Over a 2-year time horizon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was actually surprised at this. I mean, I wasn't surprised with NHS talking therapies, which is for depression and anxiety disorders for adults, because that was what we had said to Tony Blair beforehand, and that's turned out to be correct. But I was interested and pleased. The same turned out to be true of the addiction thing, based on, you know, a great deal of evidence that's assembled in this. And I should say the supporting papers by our colleagues to all of these different estimates. And even more surprising to me, it came out that within 2 years the child spending would pay for itself, because there's so much costs from special education and so on, and from criminal justice, that a proper treatment for mental health problems, either of anxiety leading to school phobia and so on, or conduct disorder leading, in fact, you know, to delinquency and so on. So it's, I mean, anybody can read these papers and see whether they find them credible, but some of them surprised me.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'll take some questions that have come in online now, and perhaps Amanda, I'll come to you first on these. So a couple, I think, relate to one another. Mikhail has said, why hasn't this happened yet, even though, as we've said, the Green Book and the Magenta Book both address wellbeing evaluations? What have been the barriers to uptake in government? And I think related to that, Isabel has asked, how do we ensure cost-benefit analyses are consistent across government so that strategic cross-cutting decisions can be made on spending? So how can we ensure that sort of consistency, and how do we do this more?
Why hasn't it happened? I think the reasons are linked to what I said earlier, actually, which are firstly that it's very hard to come up with numbers one can be confident in, and secondly there's a concern about double counting, and then additional to that, time is quite limited and you have to prioritise, and this is quite a sort of scary area to get into, if you like, because the numbers can be quite large and they're quite uncertain, which is why a sort of strategic push and some noise about it, combined with developing expertise and confidence, would be valuable. In terms of consistency across government, it seems to me that across government, departments are more consistent than one might think, looking at the differences of what they do. And I think a major part of that is probably that, as much commented on by the IFG, people do move around a government a lot, and economists are no exception. So you do get a range of expertise and a range of people who've worked in other departments looking at things. But we support that within government with cross-cutting groups where you need it. Clearly, working across government is never straightforward. Ideally, one would always do a little bit more. I think this is an area where we need to think quite carefully, strategically, and there's a particular risk of getting inconsistencies across government if you're doing something new and fresh, which is important.
COVID, classic example, you know, no consistent view about value of life and all the rest of it. And you look at the analysis, and if the review is doing what one would hope it would do, you would look at some of these things, and that would be quite a serious thing would have big impacts.
But there is a value of life figure.
There is a value of life figure.
So you're saying it wasn't being used?
No. I mean, well, closing schools, you know, that, I don't know, you know, I haven't seen all the papers, but it will be interesting to know when all of this is analysed as to how consistent and rational the whole process was. That's all I will say.
Any thoughts on that, Conrad?
I'll leave that one to the inquiry.
No, very wise. I can say that, you can't.
So we've got time. I think there was one more question in the audience already, which I'll take.
Seems like far too long ago, but I worked on the local government wellbeing power and the framework that was with that, where local authorities came up with a strategy to decide the wellbeing of their area, working with partnerships across all the local partners and businesses and voluntary sector. If something like that were to happen again, obviously local government feels like it's been hollowed out considerably. How would we build the capacity for a shared agenda on this well-being, at a national and a local level? And do we call the local level the micro, or are they actually operating in a macro level as well?
Could you repeat it?
So the question was, how do we think about this within local government, having a shared understanding between central government and local government of what contributes to well-being? Should there be a shared understanding of how we value well-being at local level to be consistent with central government decisions?
Of course, we want local government to be doing exactly the same kind of appraisal as central government, obviously. And they've got their own budget, let them spend it in a way that maximises the well-being of their people.
So another question, how do you build the capacity in local government to be
Well,
able to do that?
I think this is a big issue. I mean, we haven't really got to grips with this yet. There is a big job to be done in building the capacity in central and local government to do this type of analysis well. Some of this work was already done by the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, but there's an awful lot more to be done, especially probably in local government. And then there's to build it into the actual sequence of meetings that happen, at which decisions are made. All of that is I would have thought, a project almost for somebody to be addressing.
And remember, it's not just local government, civil society as well, more generally, and that's what Pro Bono Economics is trying to do, is help charities actually measure their well-being impact.
Conrad, I mean, is there a role for the Treasury here in sort of providing guidance and building up capacity across government? And also to pick up on the point you made before about the need for better evaluation evidence, are we in the right place at the moment in terms of making sure that that evaluation evidence is generated to build up a knowledge base?
So I definitely think there's a big role for central government, Treasury and DLUC, on this question of capacity building in local government and helping them think about policy in the same way. I think that is both, setting out like the government's overall objectives for what it is, it is trying to achieve, and that local government is a sort of key delivery partner of. I think it is also about using the sort of networks that already exist, exposing them to the analysis that already exists and the kind of guidance that already exists. I can see, it must have been a sort of a big challenge when you were doing it before to sort of, I know how difficult it is to do the awareness raising around central government, so doing it around, hundreds of local authorities, equally difficult. On kind of impact evaluation evidence itself, this is a kind of long-running issue which the Treasury has, pushed on for a number of years, and the most recent, set of initiatives we've been taking have been around the evaluation task force. I think, there are some quite important principled things that the Treasury can do, including demonstrating that allocations in spending reviews and advice to ministers about how to prioritise within spending reviews are reactive to that evidence, so that you have a kind of demand pull, as well as placing a series of trying to encourage people to do proper evaluations of policies when they are undertaken, and actually doing things as simple as coming back round and checking that 4 years ago you said you were going to do an impact evaluation of this policy. What does it actually say? So that kind of thing can actually really sort of help gear the system up, because all the guidance is there and I think all the willingness is there, but it just takes continued pressure and effort from all bits of the system for it to really be effective.
I mean, another obvious issue is the capacity in academia to generate this knowledge base. So before the 2019 election, we were quite near to having a UKRI initiative for a wellbeing research network across the country, which would have got us a lot further than where we are now. And I think it would be tremendous if somebody could resurrect that idea.
Right, there's one option for the spending review, Conrad. Bid is in.
Yeah.
Gus or Amanda, do you want to? come in?
No, I'm fine, thanks.
Okay. In that case, we are sadly now at the end of our time. So thank you very much for joining us for today's event. Big thank you to Richard for the new report and for presenting today. It's been really fascinating provocation, got us all thinking about how the government should be planning its spending for the next few years. Big thank you also to our other panellists, to Conrad, fresh off his holidays, so thanks very much, in a very good well-being state today, to Gus and to Amanda. Please join me in thanking them. We will be making video and sound recordings of today's event available if you want to watch any of it back or share it with anyone who wasn't able to make it today. The next IFG event on our calendar is on Thursday this week at lunchtime, where we'll be talking about the ministers' database that IFG has been collating on ministers since 1979. Some of our audience today may be in that database. So we'll be talking about what insights that generates on what we understand about ministers and how you will now be able to access it publicly, and what you might be able to do with that. We also have a large programme of events coming up at party conferences. So if you're going to be there, please do take a look, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.
Thank you.